Welcome to the Multiply Project podcast. I'm Jeff.
And I'm Craig.
In this episode, you, Craig, are sitting down with a longtime friend of ours, Yucan Chiu. Craig, you and I both have had the privilege of serving alongside Yucan for a season, and if there's one thing I know about him, it's that he sees the kingdom through a global lens that probably most of us aren't quite used to.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Jeff. Yucan has this incredible ability to spot leaders in places that traditional churches often overlook. And in this conversation, we're challenging the idea that church planners have to be professional clergy. I mean, Yucan shows us that multiplication is actually the global norm, and it usually happens through marketplace leaders and everyday overcomers.
So good. If you have ever felt like your church is talent poor, lacking maybe church planters, or you're waiting for a seminary graduate to move into your town so you can finally plant a church, this episode's for you. We're going to move from the safety of recruitment to the deep work of scouting. So let's jump into the conversation with Yucan Chiu.
I'm excited to have a conversation today with my friend Yucan Chiu. We are on opposite coasts. So I'm coming to you from California. He's coming to you from New York. And that means we don't get to sit down and have conversations as often as we'd like. But I'm excited that we get to sit down today, have a conversation, share that with you. Talking about global church planting. Yucan, tell us a little bit about what you're doing right now. And give a little bit of your background too, so everybody knows who you are and kind of why you are capable of speaking into global church planting.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. It's definitely good to be here with you and others watching. Yeah, so my name is Yucan Chiu. It is a Chinese name, just in case you're wondering. So I'm Chinese American. My parents immigrated here to the U.S. as single adults when immigration law changed in the 60s. And I was born here in Chicago, actually, and grew up all around the U.S., but my formative years were in California. I spent 26 years in California.
That's why I like you so much. You're from California.
Exactly. The California connection, for sure. But while there, I got a call to ministry. Well, came to Christ as a teenager, got called into ministry, was able to plant a church there, and start a church planting network that also then brought me to the East Coast, and then kind of expanded globally. That church planting network is called the Ethnos Network. It focuses on multi-ethnic urban churches next to major universities. And then while I was doing that, there was another season of transition. Long story short, got invited to join the Redeemer City to City team and to serve the global ecosystem there. So I lead a team to service the global movement of city to city right now as well. So that's what brings me to Manhattan. Yeah.
Yes, that is awesome. When you founded Ethnos, just talk a little bit about your vision, because that's something that didn't, maybe I've missed a piece that really was global at the beginning, but I don't know that, was your vision that big at the beginning, or did it evolve into something that is now global?
Yeah, great question. So part of how the church got started was, in so many church planting stories, I think are like this. There's a church planter or church planting team that has these sort of apostolic, perhaps evangelistic desires for a place or a people group. And maybe they can't put it quite in words yet, but that's what their heart tells them they need to do. They start doing it, there's fruit, and something happens, right? And somewhere along the line, there's affirmation, there's encouragement, there's even training, and they become, quote unquote, a church planter. So anyways, in my journey, that's sort of what happened. There was a deep sense of calling and desire. And at the early stages, that involved cross-cultural, multicultural, efforts, mostly driven by Jesus. Like in my understanding of Jesus at the time, I think about John chapter 4, and now Jesus is at the get-go trying to get his disciples to think beyond Jewish people because the gospel is bigger than Jewish people. And then it was partially driven by my context. I was in San Diego at the time, next to UC San Diego, and at that time when we first planted our church, I mean, 97% of our zip code was not going to a church on a Sunday, and the zip code was deeply diverse because of the university, and so at the get-go, not just diverse like from a maybe US perspective, but diverse globally because it's one of these big research universities where people from all over the world come. And so, yeah, I would say at the beginning there was this already a global sense about it all, and then and to just give you an example of that, I mean, at the early stages, we were already doing worship in different languages at this local church because there were just that was our community. And so that became then, as we became official and grew as a network, it right away was a global network because of that.
Yeah, which is great. I don't know if you remember that my daughter went to UC San Diego,
Yeah.
and I really think, I think there were, dynamics that were in play, from things that we had exposed her to, but really what has now become, her global lifestyle, I think accelerated there. She spent more time at UC San Diego with people who were from someplace else in the world than she did with people who were from California. And so, since then she's lived in Japan and she went to school in Paris. She's lived in Sarajevo. She lives in Amman, Jordan right now. We'd be much happier if that hadn't happened because then our granddaughter would be closer than 27 hours of flight away. But I do think that just, even though that was, clearly in an American context and probably in some ways she went because she wanted to be close to the beach, what she met was a whole bunch of people from all over the world. And that definitely changed her perspective on a lot of things. City to City, maybe has a similar story, right? City to City began, in New York. Probably most of the people who would listen to this podcast are familiar with Keller. We probably don't need to go into that. But, there was a point I know from conversations I've had with others on the team where sort of City to City went from New York focused to becoming a global entity. And now is clearly that very much a global organization. Talk a little bit about what that looks like for City to City, because my guess is probably most of our listeners who are American still probably think of City to City primarily in that New York context framework where lots of great things still happen, but it's much bigger than that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we don't have to go through the whole origin story. Actually, City to City next year will be celebrating 25 years. And so kind of in preparation for that, we've released one season of the history of City to City. It's called Fire is Lit. And so you can go online and find it. That talks about how it happened, like how it became global. But yeah, right now, City to City, we are, our global footprint is, on all the continents. And I would say, like, I think last year we planted, let's just say 500 churches. I think it's around there. I think about 400 of the 500 were not in the US. And so, yeah, I mean, the majority of our work is global now. And it's a really beautiful work. I think we have training. I forget the number of languages at the moment off the top of my head. I think it's like 17 languages, Urdu, Bengali, Mongolians in translation. Like you just like, it's kind of crazy what God is.
Yeah. And I think there's a dynamic, people aren't aware of this. When you get to that number, you're beyond the commonly spoke languages, right? You have, the commonly spoke languages in the world where, okay, it's English and Spanish and French is more spoken than people realize because that's a lot of Africa. Mandarin, there's just some things but you get to like 7 or 8 languages, like, okay, that's 80-90% of the world. And so when you move beyond that, you realize, okay, we're now starting to work in very specialized places to provide language for very specific people groups, which is really unique. The other unique dynamic is cities, right? I mean, it is city to city. So though you are in all of those places, there is a city focus. From your perspective, how does that make city to city unique from some of the other things? Again, in American context, we hear a lot about church multiplication. Particularly, we hear people are a lot about, DMM, CPM, disciple making movements, church planting movements. And I know that some of those are happening in urban environments, but there's a lot of urban environments you're working in with city to city that are very different from the places and spaces where those movements are happening.
Yeah.
So just talk a little bit about that city urban focus and what that looks like.
And the challenges. Yeah. I mean, I think many of us are probably aware that cities are unique environments that are not only very diverse, but very fluid, meaning the people are constantly coming in and out. And the layers upon layers of different people groups and demographics are just really fascinating in cities. And because of that, yeah, some of the principles maybe of like a discipleship making movement or like, of what was developed in the US in the suburbs with like Saddleback Sam or something like that, or it's maybe very hard to apply because it's just the city is a different environment. Now, that's not to say it's all bad. Of course, there are some beautiful advantages to the gospel and how the gospel multiplies. And history has continued to prove that like God somehow does some beautiful work in cities, and I mean, I just think about Acts chapter 2 is in Jerusalem in a dense moment where all these different people were together, that the Spirit of God was poured out and all these languages are being spoken. And, it's the birth of the church. So there's definitely something to be said about how God moves and works in cities. But I do think, yeah, in this moment in time, especially if we're influenced by North American or U.S. Christianity, there has been historically in the last 40, 50 years, just a heavy kind of maybe non-city emphasis in our church planting work. And I'm grateful that, that has, I would say, has changed, continues to change as the urban church and the urban movements are highlighted, like city to city.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it just sort of observationally, I'm not old enough to have experienced all of this, but I'm not young anymore. I live in a neighborhood. I actually live in a house that was built the same year I was born. So it's been here for a while. It's not a new neighborhood. But there was a time when it was a brand new neighborhood. And so I think sometimes when we look at some of the suburban centric nature of the church in America, can seem kind of backwards. I'll even hear people kind of criticize it. But if you back up, there's churches in my community that were planted when people were moving into these communities, and it made missional sense. You sort of
Absolutely. Absolutely.
why wouldn't you? I mean, if it happened again, you do it again. It's just, but what's happened is, as the cities have grown, Sacramento, where I live, the city itself is only about 500,000, but the metropolitan area is like 2.7 million people. And so, kind of like you said, it just sort of has this life of its own, and pockets of people and neighborhoods. And so, I guess I would, missiologically, you start to think about it differently. And for me, some of that, as I've started to realize, is that's just sort of the evolution of time. It's not a critique of what somebody did in 1960 to plant a church in my neighborhood. That was a great idea. It's the fact that it's 1925 and everything's different than it was then. And so you have to rethink, what is our strategy going to be and how do we reach a city? And it's fascinating. Multiply Project is focused on church planters, and really, some people, I know this sounds strange, we're focused on making church planters, right? There's a lot of organizations and tools and systems that are designed to help people plant churches, in a sense, who are already church planters. and you and I know each other from our time doing some of those things together. For Multiply Project, we've really tried to step back and just ask this question: how do we make more church planters? And it's a different question than how do we plant more churches. So, what are you seeing in the context you're working in? Where are church planters coming from?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I think, in some ways it's surprising, but again, it's kind of like I love what you're saying, Craig. Like sometimes we forget that we're part of this 2,000-year-old movement of Jesus, right? So like this has happened in our 2,000 years, but sometimes if we don't study it, we don't realize,
Right.
It's been around. But some of the more fascinating ones that really encourage me, I would say, include healthy church planting families.
Hmm.
That not only has the family planted healthy churches, they have maintained like just being healthy families. So I've seen church planters whose kids have become great church planters in many cultures around the world. And it's not just because it's not simply because they grew up around church planting. I mean, we all know, at least in the U.S. context, there's that story about the PK who just goes off the rails, and that happens all over the world too, right? So you got to be a healthy family. You got to be like on point with the gospel and missiological, all those things. But I love seeing that, and I love seeing it when like the let's say the 50-year-old mother and father, they are still innovating as lead church planters, lead pastors, and so their kids continue to grow in this innovation context. And so when they finally hit the age of like say 24 and they're ready to go, I mean, that's just the environment they grew up in, right? So that's really cool to see. Yeah, and then I think the other thing that needs to be noted is that church planners come from all over the place, meaning the pipeline isn't some type of like Bible school or seminary or something like that. It's like, there are these healthy churches around that are composed of people in the marketplace, people, doing service sector jobs, just all kinds of people. And as a vision as the burden for the gospel is embedded in that local church, like so-and-so business owner realizes, well, I got to reach out to my fellow business people, and oh, my pastor says that can be a church plant. Okay, great. Let me get the training. Let's get going. And it's pretty normal. I would say it's normal. I think globally, outside of the West, like it's pretty normal that church planters are not quote unquote professionally theologically trained. Like that's not how they got into church planting. They just got in because they just saw the need, felt the call, had a good church environment that helped them get there.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess a couple different questions that I want to dig into a little deeper on that. One of the curiosities that I have is sort of how people recognize, affirm a sense of calling, and particularly across cultures, because that's something that we could look at the scripture and we could sort of say, okay, we've got some models. Paul sees a light, hears a voice, and we have different kinds of things, and he has dreams, but it's not like we go to the New Testament and find this, this is how a person is called, step 1, step 2, step 3, that, kind of becomes this universal, pattern for everyone to follow. So it just makes me curious in some different cultural contexts, like what are you observing? How are you seeing, or maybe you have some illustrations or examples where you'd say, yeah, in this culture context, this is a story I hear, but in this culture, it's this story. And are there similarities, differences? What do you notice about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think, Craig, you put your finger on something, like, right. Even in the New Testament, we just actually, as we do a deep dive, we just see so many different ways this happens. Like the story I like to tell a lot as I look at the New Testament is, perhaps the most influential church plant in the New Testament is Antioch. They send out Paul. I mean, it's just like you talk about a church plant that planted a lot of churches. Like, I mean, that's it. I mean, I don't know what else you could say. And Antioch was planted by people who were displaced, refugees that we have no names of. There was no superstar that planted the church, right? It's like the scattering that happened after Stephen, and there it is, right? Like, and so we could even see that today, like, as refugees as people are getting displaced, believe it or not, churches are getting planted through that. But it's as old as Acts, right?
As Acts, yes. Yeah. I did a study before writing the Antioch Way, or as I was writing. One of the things I did is just a study to try and identify, okay, all the churches that are named, or all the churches we can identify in any way at all throughout the whole New Testament, who started them, and what, if anything, do we sort of know about that church's origin story? And what's funny is how many churches there are that are named in the New Testament. We know nothing about their origin story. And then you have this church in Antioch that you mentioned, which is, we probably ought to have up there with Jerusalem, right? And, we have the whole Jerusalem origin story, but the sum of the Antioch origin story is some people were scattered and went there and started telling people about Jesus. That's the origin story. But I wrote about the book. I think that's part of why Antioch became the sending church that it became, though, right? Its origin story was, we just go to where there's people who don't know Jesus and we tell them about Jesus. It was really that simple.
Yeah. And then they also send out the most strategic guy on church flag too. So it's like this beautiful, like both and I think that just, that happens globally, right? There's just so many ways that, at least in the little picture I get to see, like so many ways that people are getting called to plant churches. And it's pretty exciting. Like I think about, I guess I think about the many times, people through their own journey of faith just get into a healthy church plant. And that church plant, again, it's not like this superstar church. It's not a mega church. It's a good, healthy church of maybe 70 people, 120 people, maybe 300 people. And because the church is vibrant and believes in Jesus and the call to keep planting, like within their own local church, like people start getting raised up, teams start forming, the pastor has a good vision and the leadership team, and a church plant just comes out of that, and it's beautiful. It's beautiful.
Yeah, that's great. It would be interesting, I guess, to think, sort of what is the dynamic? I think because, again, in American context, church planting has had a lot of financial strategy around it. And so finances have always sort of been, at least I shouldn't always, but in my lifetime of experience, and I planted a church when I was 26, so I can claim I've been doing this in American context for a while. Just like the financial strategies always been integral to whatever it was that you were doing to plant a church. And I think sometimes that hinders a lot of church planting and has even resulted a little bit in, like a church saying, well, we can't plant a church because we don't have enough money, right? Whereas the mega giga church, they can plant a church because they have more money. And the reality is the mega giga church might be giving less a percent of their total. I don't know, but sometimes that's just literally just a function of size, right? Two churches that give 2% of their money to church planting, and one has thousands of people and one has hundreds of people. Guess which one has more money? It's not like that large church is giving 20%. It's just that it's, whatever is just bigger. But I think what you're describing is that it's not actually the money. What you're saying is it's not the money that makes the difference. What makes a difference is the culture of the church. And my guess is, if we wanted to put anything on it, it's not even church size, it's disciple making. If churches are making disciple making and people are seeing people's lives transformed, that creates a culture that leads to multiplication of disciples, and ultimately then that leads to multiplication of churches.
Absolutely. 100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. What percentage, not obviously maybe you have data, but I'd be curious, just a guess. You think about those 400 churches that have been planted globally, probably, I'm going to guess not all of them were planted by a solo church planter. It's a very American way of doing things. Lots of teams, people engaged in that. What percentage of that 400 would be full-time church planters getting a salary to plant a church?
Wow. I, I, I actually would love to do a deep dive on the data myself. I don't have that data, but anecdotally, I would say like close to 0%. Like
One out of
honestly,
100, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think about some of the, and I'll put on my Ethnos network hat on now. Again, I'm still deeply engaged with that, just because with the Ethnos network, I still get to like actually coach like church planners on the ground.
Right.
In the city, I'm more like regional strategy stuff, but like, man, I mean, the churches that are planting churches. Number one, the churches are led by co-vocational pastors anyway.
Anyway, right.
Yeah, because the reality is like their financial ecosystem, their GDP, like there's just, I mean, it's just not even like possible. Like it's not even a
Right.
category they think about because it's not
Right.
possible.
Right.
And so it's just naturally like, oh yeah, like everyone has a job, everyone's involved in ministry and plants churches. Like it's just kind of like the norm, you know. So I think and yes, yes, are there stressors in terms of capacity for sure, yes. But do they ever worry about I don't have enough money to plant a church like maybe we do in the U.S. Like it's just not a question really
Right.
in
Yeah.
context. Yeah,
Yeah. That's just an interesting dynamic.
yeah, yeah.
What percentage, and obviously this, again, just right anecdotally, do you see that in your global context, there are more often teams planting churches as opposed to sort of the single sent church planter? And maybe, and I'm not saying that there isn't a leader. I'm not sort of talking about a different kind of ecclesiology or polity within the church, but more just the fact that you know uh, the people who go or the people who are sent are not a church planter or a church planting couple. The people who go or are sent from the beginning are a team. It's a group that goes. Is that more common in your global context?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's more common. I do think uh, the manifestations of like a solo planter are different. Meaning, I think we have maybe our solo planter mentality is influenced by a certain type of Western individualism, for example. In other cultures, where while like they are communal, they also have like a top-down authority structure. So there's like the bigger man kind of cultural dynamic that can get broken and distorted by sin. And so you'll have a solo planter in some of those cultures, but it's not driven by individualism. It's driven by a kind of authoritarian, bigger
Yeah.
man sort of
Okay.
mentality. And so I would say it's interesting. Yeah, and I'd be curious if there are some formal studies on that dynamic. I do think, just like I would argue in the U.S., globally, I do think, and again, I just think this is the way Jesus designed things. He sent us out two by two, anyways. Like the best plants are always, have a multi-layered kind of community around the planter and the planting team. It is a need. Yeah,
Yep.
for sure.
Yeah, that was one of the other things when I it just sort of did that biblical overview and just sort of read through the whole New Testament and ask the question, is this a church? Who started it? When? How? And what you realize is there's not a single example in the New Testament of a church being started by an individual. It's always at least two people. You could sort of say, Saul and Barnabas, for example. But even in Antioch, it's not a man that went to Antioch. It's men who it's a group who are going together. And so it's just a fascinating thing. I can't say that there weren't individuals who planted some of the churches that we don't know their origin story. So I don't want to overstate it. But you can't find the example. You can't say, well, there's the example of the church that was started by an individual. It's just not there. And so it's fascinating. What are you finding from an equipping perspective? So sort of switch gears, your phases, what are you seeing as most effective? Someone says, I think God wants me to plant a church. I feel like that's what I'm supposed to do. I don't think the context changes the fact that people need to be equipped, right? They need to be trained. That's probably pretty universal. But what are you seeing, ethnos, city to city? What's being most fruitful from a training perspective in the global cities that you're engaged in?
Yeah. It's fascinating. Again, I think it's helpful for a Western audience perhaps to realize that certain things we experience here in the West are actually global trends. And that's could be helpful to hear. Why I bring that up is because, for example, the first thing that comes to mind is actually mental health. Because, here in the US, we have an emphasis on mental health, which, has extremes that are good and bad, but at the center of it is like, hey, we have to be healthy, emotionally healthy, relationally healthy, mentally healthy, to be fruitful, to bear fruit, right? And that reality, I think, is actually, by God's grace, I think there's a global movement of mental health as well. And so, I think there are parts in the world where there's a unique and good focus, a contextual focus on the church planting marriage and the health of the marriage. And they're like in Japan, there's some really fascinating things they're doing with making sure Japanese couples are healthy as they plant a church. And then there's, depression is a global thing. It's
a human thing, right? It's not a cultural thing.
Right? Yeah. And so I'm really grateful when I look at the global movement that there are key pockets in the world where those things are being dealt with. As in the States. And just like the States, there are plenty of pockets where that's not being dealt with. So that's true of the globe. So that's one thing. I think the other thing that I appreciate about what I've observed in the globe is that in certain parts of the world, there's a clear pathway, a clear journey of development that goes for 2 to 3 years. Really being with the planter in really intentional, beautiful, communal, mentoring, coaching sort of ways for 2 to 3 years. And I think that's needed, necessary, really important. And I think globally too, there are just great things happening in terms of helping people continue to remember that we do need new wineskins for the moment. The old wineskins just aren't going to work. You got to remember, in many parts of the world, because of British, French, Spanish colonialism, there's institutional Christianity. In fact, in some places, even stronger than the U.S.
Yes,
right?
yes.
It's just and it's kind of crazy. Right?
Yeah. So I know you're doing things in Latin America, and so there'd be places in Latin America where the Catholic Church is even stronger than it is here. And not to create any kind of debate about Catholicism, but just the point of sort of that there's this footprint of Christianity that is significant from a faith perspective, from a cultural perspective. And so, you don't come into a Latin American city to plant a church thinking, there's no representation of the church in this city.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Where actually there are places especially, I don't know, they are, but where you are in New York, where I am in California, you could find people who, though there are representations of church, it's not hard to find a person who has actually zero experience or zero knowledge of any church, right? The footprint is not so big that everyone knows about it. I would be curious to go to a Latin American city and try and find someone who would say, "No, I don't know anything about church. What are you talking about?" It would seem impossible.
Yeah, yeah, no, exactly, exactly. Yeah, it is so fascinating because sometimes we can think about the world again from the U.S. perspective, and every country does this, I would say, because it's just easy to think about us and then everyone else, right? So we think there may be two paradigms in the world, our paradigm and everyone else.
Yeah.
And the reality is that, I mean, just wow,
Yeah.
right? It's just not even close to what
Yeah.
reality is. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, what do you see in a global context that sort of you think about, sending churches? What are what are the some of the barriers? What are some of the places where you see people moving past that? Because I think that's one of the real challenges here in the U.S. is I don't know how far back it goes. I feel like sometimes we talk about the 70s and the church growth movement, but I feel like it probably predates that really into just the post World War II American church. There's just was sort of this growth operating system that got installed in the church. And so now, even though people talk about multiplication, the the means, the mechanisms, the just like all the stuff that makes multiplication happen, really it's foreign to the growth operating system. They're two completely different operating systems. And so there's just a lot of barriers, a lot of shifts that have to happen. Um, in our experience, things we're teaching, training, seeing, observing, a lot of them are more attitudinal than they are actually programmatic, right?
Yeah.
That it's not, oh, you need to stop meeting on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock. Oh, that's fine. That's not what's keeping you from multiplying, right? It's really more mindsets. So I'm just curious globally, do you see similar challenges? Are they different mindsets? I'm just curious, again, in that context, are there some of the same barriers or are they different barriers?
Yeah, Craig, I think you said something earlier that there are human issues that
Yes,
transcend culture,
they're
right?
universal.
Like, yeah, and so I think one human issue is ego and control, right? Ego and control. Doesn't matter where you were born, what generation, what culture it is. There is a issue that is there across cultures, and so I would say, yeah, they're definitely. I see that globally. Like, yeah, where multiplication isn't happening is because of ego and control, from people on top, so to speak. Uh, Obviously, in something that's pretty different in some places compared to maybe the US is there's also state-sponsored persecution of of the church, of all kinds of things, and so uh, I think sometimes in the West we hear of God somehow is still doing amazing things because of that, and that's true. God does do that, and there are also stories. Japan would be one of them, where the state-sponsored persecution decades ago, or yeah, centuries ago, like the church did not grow past that, and it snuffed out Christianity, right? So I do think what Paul exhorts people to pray for peace so that the gospel can spread. It's a prayer we need to pray. Like, persecution isn't naturally good because, oh, that means the persecuted church will go. That's a grace of God. That's not a given. And so, but that is unique out there too, where that's a real barrier, and sometimes it really snuffs out the church. Um,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
God bless.
I again, just looking at Acts, it's an interesting dynamic because the persecution that began in Acts 8, with Stephen's stoning, is what led to the birth of the Antioch Church, is what led to really the birth of a global movement of Christianity. So it's sort of you can sort of draw the conclusion, I want to be extremely careful, right? But that the persecution was a good thing. It's the I don't want to say it was a good thing, but it was a bad thing God used to accomplish his purpose, which we know is a common thing. But I think sometimes we forget that on the flip side, the consequence of that was it wasn't very many years later till there was no Jerusalem church, right? And so yes, this good thing happened, but this really bad thing also happened. And where there was once this, in today's terms, when we think of this thriving gigachurch, you end up with a completely obliterated city, and everyone's gone, and the church is gone, and I think we forget, again, American context, that things like that have happened around the world, and in some places, things like that are still happening around the world, and they have an effect. They have an impact on how the church and the gospel are presented or even available, if you will, in any given context.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And it is, it is, again, just like any of those really difficult situations. Like war would be another scenario too, right? War is different from, obviously, from state-sponsored persecution. But yeah, again, you have beautiful stories of the church growing through wartime situations, and also the war, snuffing out the church, right? So, and it is, for me, at least, when I think about these things, it just points to the reality that perhaps the most important, quote unquote, method of church planting out there is we need to run to Jesus, because he plants the church, and we just need to, in our context, cry out to him and discern his voice and understand what he's inviting us to do.
Yeah. We talk about series of shifts that churches have to make to become multiplying, and the one that we have put at the top is prayer. And we talk about it, again, American Western context, as a shift from planning to praying, because it seems like in our Western context, then we think of a good thing, we want to multiply, or there's people who want to reach. The first thing that we do is plan.
Yeah.
That's what good Americans do. What good Westerners do. We plan, but that's not what we see in the scripture, right? Yeah, like what we see in the scripture is we start with prayer, and it's not that planning is bad. It's not, or that we shouldn't plan, and we don't want to try to communicate that. A lot of these shifts are, what do you do first? What do you give priority to? Not giving one thing up for the others. You don't give up planning for praying. You put prayer ahead of planning. And that then changes your planning. Your prayers inform your planning rather than your planning informing your prayers. So I would definitely agree with that. And I think there are plenty of stories, examples globally where the church has operated much more out of prayer than out of planning, and you see the fruit of that. For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Our Focus Multiply Project, we're trying to help churches call, equip, send planters. Again, it's sort of that interesting challenge, of what's universal, what's human as opposed to what's culturally specific. For a pastor that's listening, what's one practice or a couple of things that you would say, hey, if you really want to be a multiplying church, here's some things that you could do starting today or tomorrow that don't require giving up everything that is part of your church program, but that if you would do these things, they actually lead to the fruit of multiplication.
Yeah. I think it really helps, obviously, to figure out a way to start talking about it as a church, right? And talking about it, of course, first with your leaders, your staff, and all that stuff, for sure. But talking about it as a whole church, like, again, I think the best sort of multiplying churches have a culture of multiplication, which means it's actually talked about, right? And so, like, I think that would be a fascinating thing to just mentally, at the very least, map out. If you're a pastor listening, you're like, man, I want to get there. It's like, well, that'd be a really simple first exercise. Well, how would I start talking about this, right? Like, you already mentioned prayer, of course. How might we start praying about this? And I feel like those two things, they'll take things a long way, like God will begin to reveal things, help you discover things. We talk about ego, and control. Again, I think I remember when I planted the first Ethnos, and we began the process of planting and becoming a network and all these things. I remember wrestling through just how this was going to happen. And a mentor of mine, we were just reading Acts, again, going back to Antioch. We were reading Antioch, and you read about Antioch releasing Paul and Barnabas, right, sending them out. And my mentor said something that has stuck with me ever since, like, Antioch gave the best. Right? If you were a growing church and your best top 2 leaders would you send out your top 2 leaders?
Yeah. And so on some of our workshops, it's a question I ask. I said, how would you like to have been the person who got assigned to tell the rest of the congregation that Barnabas and Paul were being sent to plant churches, right? Your favorite teacher and your most encouraging pastor, they're leaving.
Yeah. It's so so goes against our grain for control and wanting the best for ourselves. And so there's this, I love what Jesus said, unless a weed of grain falls to the ground and dies, it can't multiply, right? So it's there is a quote unquote death that has to happen. Ego, death of control. And yet there's something so beautiful on the other side.
Yeah.
And so that's a heart issue, right, that we all have to wrestle through.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's good. Well, hey, thank you for spending some time with me today and just letting us chat about global. I love the fact that I got to get caught up on a bunch of things that are going on in your world and hear some good things that were helpful for me, hopefully for others. I'm grateful for that. Grateful for the work that you do. And I know the work of both Ethnos and City to City is significant here in the U.S. and around the world. And so very much, though I don't know that I can say that we necessarily collaborate in any specific ways, I definitely cheer and celebrate people who are doing very much the same work that we are doing. And I'm grateful for both. And so glad to have you join us today and share some of what you're learning and seeing with our listeners as well. So thanks, Yucan.
Thanks, Craig. It's a pleasure being here.
Jeff, every time I talk to Yucan, I am reminded that multiplication isn't just a strategy. It's a heart posture. He mentioned that ego death of letting go of our best people. And man, that is the hurdle that most of us have to clear if we want to be multipliers.
Yeah, it really is. And the shift starts when you stop looking for that finished product for the person in the cape to walk into the room. And you start looking for potential. It's a different lens that you're looking through. You don't have to wait for a hero. Your next planter is likely a service worker or a business owner sitting in the seats of your church right now. You just need the eyes to see them.
Yeah, so we really want to challenge you, be a kingdom scout this week. We've made it easy for you to start. Head over to the show notes, download our Church Planter Scouting Guide. It's the exact tool you need to help you recognize 9 characteristics that we've identified are often in people who have the potential to become church planters. So don't just lead a congregation. Be the one who identifies the next movement maker.
Yeah, it's so good. Take a look at the guide. Spend some time with the guide and praying through it and begin to identify the people in your church with potential. Thanks for joining us today, and we will see you next time on the Multiply Project podcast.